The market is quiet, at the exact moment it should be reacting. Three separate catalysts, each capable of moving billions in capital, have converged within the same narrow window. Tokyo is signaling structural intent. Tariff pressures are beginning to distort global trade flows. And in the United States, regulatory language around digital assets is approaching something dangerously close to clarity. And yet, XRP hasn't moved the way most expected. That's the paradox, because if markets were purely reactive, this would already be priced in. Volatility would be expanding, not compressing. Narratives would be aligning, not fragmenting. But instead, what we're seeing is hesitation, a kind of unnatural stillness that doesn't match the weight of the moment. So, the question isn't whether something is happening. The question is why it isn't visible yet. Because historically, the most important market transitions don't begin with expansion. They begin with silence, with compression, with a kind of behavior that feels disconnected from reality until suddenly it isn't. And this is where most investors make their mistake. They assume that movement confirms importance, that price validates narrative. But in environments like this, the opposite is often true. The less the market reacts, the more it may be absorbing. And over the next 48 hours, that distinction may become impossible to ignore. Because what happens next isn't just about XRP. It's about whether the market is ready to reprice something it has fundamentally misunderstood. What makes this moment particularly disorienting is the disconnect between expectation and behavior. Retail participants were positioned for movement. Not subtle movement, but expansion. A break in structure. Because when you combine geopolitical pressure, regulatory momentum, and cross-border financial signaling, the assumption is straightforward. Price should respond. But it hasn't. And that creates a psychological fracture. Because now the narrative splits in two directions. On one side, you have those interpreting this as weakness, a failure to react. A sign that perhaps the catalysts aren't as meaningful as they appeared. On the other side, there are those who recognize that markets don't always telegraph their intentions through immediate price action. And this is where it becomes interesting. Because the more obvious the setup appears, the less likely the market is to reward it in a predictable way. Especially in an asset like XRP, where perception has historically lagged behind structural development. So instead of clarity, what we get is noise, conflicting interpretations, mixed signals, a kind of informational congestion that makes it difficult to form conviction. And that's not accidental. Markets tend to create the most doubt right before they resolve it. But that's not the most important part. What matters more is what's happening beneath that confusion. Because while price remains compressed, activity doesn't necessarily stop. Liquidity doesn't disappear. It shifts. It reorganizes. It waits. And when you start looking at this phase not as inactivity, but as misaligned visibility, a different picture begins to form. One that most participants are not yet positioned to see. The assumption most investors make in moments like this is that nothing is happening. That price, in its stillness, is telling you the truth. But price is often the last thing to move, not the first. Because what looks like stagnation on the surface is very often a process underneath. A transfer of positioning, a quiet reallocation from weaker hands to stronger ones. And more importantly, a period where the market is testing conviction without offering confirmation. This is not weakness, it is absorption. And absorption phases are structurally necessary before any meaningful repricing can occur. Not because the asset lacks demand, but because the demand needs time to consolidate without driving price prematurely higher. If it moved too early, it would invite instability, volatility without foundation. So instead, the market does something counterintuitive. It compresses. It creates a range that feels almost artificial in its tightness. A zone where both bullish and bearish narratives lose momentum and participants begin to disengage emotionally. Volume may appear average, volatility declines, attention shifts elsewhere. But that's exactly the point. Because when attention leaves, efficiency increases. There is less interference, fewer reactive flows, more controlled positioning. And this is where it becomes important to separate visibility from reality. Just because something isn't being expressed through price doesn't mean it isn't developing structurally. In fact, some of the most significant market transitions begin in environments that feel like this: quiet, uncertain, and easy to dismiss. But here's what most don't consider. Repricing events don't start when everyone is watching. They start when almost no one is. If you step back from the price chart and look at behavior instead, a different pattern begins to emerge. Institutions do not wait for clarity. They position into it. This is where the retail framework tends to break down. because most participants are conditioned to seek confirmation first and opportunity second. Institutions invert that sequence. They identify structural inevitabilities, allocate early, and allow clarity to validate them later. And this is where names like BlackRock and Franklin Templeton become relevant, not as headlines but as signals. These are not entities that react impulsively to short-term narratives. Their movements are slow, deliberate, and often invisible until after the fact. When they engage with digital asset infrastructure, whether directly or indirectly, it tends to reflect a longer-term thesis about where capital efficiency is heading. And that's the key distinction. This is not about chasing volatility. It's about positioning around systems. Because when large capital begins to consider alternative settlement layers, it's not driven by price speculation. It's driven by inefficiency in existing rails. Cost, speed, transparency. These become variables that matter at scale. And XRP, whether acknowledged publicly or not, exists within that conversation. But that's not the most revealing part. What matters more is how institutions behave before a shift becomes obvious. They don't create noise, they reduce it. They operate in phases where liquidity is available and attention is low, where they can build exposure without triggering aggressive repricing. And that aligns uncomfortably well with what we're seeing now. A market that feels inactive but is structurally engaged. A price that appears stagnant but is potentially being stabilized. And a narrative environment that feels uncertain, precisely because certainty is not yet meant to be visible. Because once it is, the opportunity no longer exists in the same form. And then there is the layer most investors are waiting for, but still underestimating. Regulation, not as a headline, but as a structural unlock. Because for years, XRP has existed in a kind of legal gray zone. Not fully restricted, but not fully defined. And that ambiguity has done something subtle but powerful. It has suppressed participation from the very entities that move markets at scale. Not because they lack interest, but because they require clarity. And this is where the Clarity Act begins to matter. Not as a guarantee, not as a catalyst in isolation, but as part of a broader regulatory shift that is slowly removing friction from the system. At the same time, signals outside the United States are beginning to align. Tokyo, in particular, has been moving with a level of intentionality that doesn't attract headlines, but does attract capital. Regulatory frameworks in Japan have historically been more structured, more defined. And when you start to see coordination, implicit or otherwise, between major financial regions, it suggests something larger is forming. But here's where the tension builds. Because regulatory clarity does not immediately create price expansion. In many cases, it delays it. Why? Because once clarity begins to emerge, institutions don't rush in all at once. They prepare, they assess, they structure exposure in ways that minimize disruption. Which means the visible impact often lags behind the actual shift. And that creates a window. A narrow one, where the narrative says uncertain, but the structure says resolving. And this is where most participants hesitate. Because they are waiting for confirmation that, by design, arrives too late. But while most attention remains fixed on regulation and headlines, a quieter force is beginning to apply pressure from a completely different direction. Macro, specifically the way tariffs are starting to reshape liquidity flows across borders. Because tariffs are not just political tools, they are financial friction. They slow movement, increase costs, and force capital to find more efficient pathways. And when that friction builds to a certain threshold, it doesn't just impact trade, it begins to influence the infrastructure that supports it. This is where it becomes less obvious but far more important. As global trade becomes more constrained, the demand for faster, cheaper settlement layers increases. Not as a theoretical upgrade, but as a necessity. Businesses operating across jurisdictions cannot afford inefficiencies when margins are already under pressure. And this is where alternative rails quietly re-enter the conversation. Not through speculation, but through utility. Because when traditional systems become more expensive to use, even marginal improvements in efficiency become meaningful at scale. And assets that facilitate that efficiency, whether directly or indirectly, begin to gain relevance in ways that are not immediately reflected in price. But that's not the most interesting part. What matters more is timing. Because macro pressure doesn't move markets instantly. It builds, it compounds, and then, almost unexpectedly, it forces adaptation. Systems that were once optional become necessary. Infrastructure that was once experimental becomes practical. And in that transition, positioning becomes everything. Because by the time the impact is visible, the advantage has already shifted. So, when you bring all of this together, the regulatory movement, the institutional behavior, the macro pressure, you don't get immediate clarity. You get alignment without recognition. And that is where the next 48 hours becomes critical. Not because something dramatic is guaranteed to happen within that window, but because this is typically when the final phase of compression either resolves or extends. When the market makes a decision about whether it is ready to transition from preparation to expression. But here's what most will miss. They will be watching for a signal that feels obvious, a breakout that confirms their bias, a headline that validates their timing. And if it doesn't appear exactly as expected, they will assume nothing has changed. But markets don't reward that kind of thinking. Because the actual shift, when it begins, rarely announces itself in a way that feels comfortable. It feels mistimed, underwhelming at first, easy to dismiss. And then, as participation increases, it accelerates beyond the point where rational positioning is still possible. And this is where it becomes less about prediction and more about preparation. Because if the alignment we're seeing is real, if regulatory clarity is approaching, if institutions are positioning, if macro conditions are reinforcing the need for alternative systems, then the move that follows will not be driven by retail conviction. It will be driven by structural necessity. And those who are waiting for perfect confirmation will be reacting to something that has already begun, quietly and without permission. In markets like this, conviction is not built when everything becomes clear. It is built in the moments where clarity is still forming, but the structure is already in place. And that is the uncomfortable truth most participants avoid. Because it requires acting without the reassurance of consensus. It requires understanding that by the time the narrative feels safe, the asymmetry has already begun to disappear. What we are potentially witnessing is not an isolated event tied to a single catalyst. It is a convergence, a slow alignment between regulation, institutional intent, and macro necessity that is reaching a point where continuation becomes more likely than reversal. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels quiet, indecisive, easy to ignore. And that is precisely why it matters. Because phases like this are designed to test patience, not reward urgency. To filter out those who require constant validation from those who can operate within uncertainty. And historically, the latter group is the one that benefits when the transition finally expresses itself. This is not about predicting a price level. It is about recognizing a phase. A phase where most will hesitate, some will disengage, and a small group will simply observe and position accordingly. Because in the end, the market does not move when it becomes obvious. It moves when the conditions no longer need to be explained.